This episode is brought to you by Kia's first three-row, all-electric SUV, the Kia EV9, with available all-wheel drive and seating for up to 7 adults, with 0 to 60 speed that thrills you 1 minute and available lounge seats that unwind you the next. Visit kia.com/EV9 to learn more. Ask your Kia dealer for availability. No system, no matter how advanced, can compensate for all driver error and or driving conditions. Always drive safely.
A science story, huh?
These NYU scientists,
I felt
right.
I was so
And I just thought, well,
I had figured it out.
it was that golden moment.
Because science was on my side.
Hey everyone, I'm Ben Lilly, and welcome to the Story Collider, where we bring you true stories of how science has affected people's lives. This week's story is from Sarah Everts. The story was recorded in February 2013 at Oberon in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The theme of the event was Metamorphosis.
So, my story begins actually a decade ago on my very first trip. And effectively, since then I have been to places like China and Syria and Papua New Guinea, but in 2002 I had just quit graduate school and I was feeling pretty lost and I didn't know what to do with my life, so I thought, I will go to Central America for 4 months. I'll go alone. I will find some inspiration, learn some Spanish, have some adventure. And so about 3 weeks into my time in Guatemala, my Spanish teacher, Azucena, says to me, hey, let's go to this market. Just about an hour outside of Quetzaltenango, which is Guatemala's second largest city. And I said, yeah, that sounds good. And when we arrive, there is an insane number of people milling around. I mean, imagine sort of a huge football game, except, and the thrust of people exiting. And add to that pigs, plastic flip-flops, women cooking tortillas, chickens running around, avocados, hot pink candy, babies. It is an overwhelming sensory experience, and I am totally euphoric. And, I scan the crowd, and I notice that I am the only gringa, and I think to myself, you have nailed this travel thing. You're hanging out with the local, you've escaped the tourists, you are a travel goddess. And it's precisely at that moment that a little black dog appears out of nowhere, bites me on the leg, and then disappears forever into the crowd. And I look down at my leg, and there's blood, and my obnoxious, self-satisfied euphoria turns into utter panic. And Azucena has a look, and she mumbles something about a remedy, and also disappears into the crowd. And for just a few minutes, my fear is replaced with the hope that she's going to return with some awesome fix-it-all remedy. And in her mind, she does. It is, when she returns, a lemon, which she cuts up and squirts into my wound. And gets rid of the rind, and starts talking about what we're going to do next. And I'm in total panic, struggling to think of how to say rabies in Spanish, and I completely lose any ability to speak the language. I mean, I had been getting pretty good at that point, but not so much. And to be honest, I had really only mastered the present, and rabies was going to happen in the future. So instead, I start acting out the final indignities of a rabid dog. And, my melodramatic side is partly pleased by the foreshadowing, I have to admit. And Azucena lets me amuse a few bystanders, some of which have now started watching me, before she poo-poos my concern. She says we don't really worry about that here. I was okay. I get home a little bit later, and I'm living with a Guatemalan family, and the mother in the family is also sort of dismissive about it. And, I really don't want to be a spoiled Canadian about this, and so I thought, okay, I'll let it drop until I am alone that evening in my room with my travel guide, and somehow I can't help myself but flip to the travel health section. And I remember what it says, because it said, canine rabies is prevalent in Guatemala. I'm like, crap. I read that either the virus can infect your cells right away, or it can be latent and hang around in your body for a few months before it infects. But once it does, it's certain death within a few weeks to a month. And the first sign of infection is that you have this intense thirst. And the next sign is that you become afraid of water. And you can imagine that this combination would drive anybody crazy. And you don't have to be a psychologist to guess that suddenly I was very thirsty all the time. So, I start dreaming about foaming at the mouth. A couple of days later, I wake up and I'm like, I have to tell my mother. So I find an internet cafe and I compose this email, which is awful, that went something like, Dear Mom, I'm having a great time. I'm hanging out with the locals, seeing Mayan ruins. I've seen a lot of animals, birds, pigs, dogs. Miss you, love Sarah, P.S. About the dogs. I sort of got bit by one, but it's totally going to be okay. And of course that was a total lie because, by this time the wound has this kind of purpley yellowish bruise. And, also by this time I have started photographing it every day for posterity, for when my mother comes to find out why I've died, and she, develops my film. It was 2002, and, realizes what happened. And, I just couldn't sleep. But I really didn't want to be a spoiled Canadian. But a couple of days later, I run into this Guatemalan guy, and he's actually a grad student in the States, just home for the holidays. And, I tell him about my, little ridiculous adventure with the dog. And he's like, yeah, you should probably get the vaccination. He's like, I've lived with this all my life. I've been bitten by dogs. I wouldn't really do anything about it, but you're Canadian. You should go and get a vaccine. But don't go to the hospital. Let me ask my friend who's a vet. I was like, okay. I was like, oh, okay. Anyway, his friend recommends this private clinic in Antigua, which is sort of a pretty touristy town, a little ways away. And a couple days later, I find myself in this waiting room full of extremely pregnant women, and me. And I go to get what I think is the human diploid vaccine, which is the typical remedy against rabies. And the shot costs $80 a pop. I go back and get 2 more, and this is like a huge splurge. It's pretty much a month of my travel budget, but finally I can sleep. And after this, I continue my travels and have adventures. I go to Honduras, Belize, and go back home to Vancouver. And I'm telling some friends about my trip, and one of them says to me, "Oh, since you've got the vaccine, does that mean that you are forever immune to rabies?" I thought, hey, that's a totally great question. I have no idea. So I thought, I'll call the Canadian Centre for Disease Control. And when I finally reach a doctor on the line, he totally flips out. He's like, where are you? Get to a hospital. You have to, what? And he's afraid that I've gotten a fake vaccine. Because it turns out that in many developing countries, between 10 and 50% of pharmaceuticals are actually counterfeit. And I'm not talking fake Viagra, I'm talking fake antimalarials, fake antibiotics that are being sold to people at very high prices that they can barely afford, even if it was the real McCoy. And I'm not talking generics. These are sugar pills, and they're sometimes laced with ecstasy because it turns out that the people who are doing the fake pharmaceutical traffic have come initially from the hard drug trafficking. And the reason they've done that is because you can make as much money with fake pharmaceuticals, but you have less consequences if you're caught. And that's because if you have... So say you're caught trafficking cocaine. In most countries, you'll be subject to criminal law. But if you're caught trafficking fake pharmaceuticals, the worst thing that can happen is infringement of patent law. So anyway, so the doctor on the phone is like, whoa! And he's like, afraid I got a fake vaccine, and he's afraid that the virus is still latent inside me, and that, at any moment I will become a foaming monster prowling the streets of Vancouver, biting little children and dogs. So I can, understand this. So I head to the hospital, and there's like a nurse at ER waiting for me. She gives me the vaccine. She takes my blood. She ships it overnight to Toronto by FedEx. The doctor calls me the next day. Suddenly, everybody's reacting with the concern I had craved in Guatemala. And it's not that Guatemalans are any less caring. It's just that many cannot afford to take every possible measure or even overreact to make sure that, when a person gets bit by a dog, it's not rabies. Individualized healthcare is not fiscally possible for most people, and therefore not socially expected, which is why most people were kind of poo-pooing my concerns. In Canada, we can freak out because we have the financial ability to do so. And as it turns out, the Canadian health authorities that went sicko had overreacted. I had gotten an appropriate vaccine in Antigua, and the worst thing that happened was that I have now a kind of mortifying pile of close-up photographs of my wound in various stages of ugliness. And of course, my poor mom, who still cannot scratch rabies off her list of concerns when I travel, because as it turns out, the answer to that question, how long does the vaccine last, is 2 years. And as for little black dogs, we have finally achieved a sort of tenuous peace. They are pretty cute, and you can't blame every little black dog for a naughty colleague in Guatemala. But I have to admit that I sort of have an embarrassing Pavlovian response when I see little black dogs. I immediately think of rabies, and I immediately get extremely thirsty. So anyway, that's my story.
That was Sarah Everts. Sarah is a science journalist. Originally from Montreal, Canada, she is currently based in Berlin, Germany, as the European correspondent for the weekly magazine Chemical and Engineering News. She runs a blog called Artful Science about the research that takes place behind the scenes in museums on art and artifacts. For more science stories, take a look at storycollider.org, where we have archives of the podcast and upcoming events. We depend on you for our continued support. If you enjoy these podcasts, please consider donating at storycollider.org/donate. The Story Collider is produced by me, Brian Wecht, Aaron Barker, and Ari Daniel Shapiro. The podcast is produced by Rose Eveleth. Additional help from Brooke Williams, Lena Groger, and Justin D'Ambrosio. The theme music is by Ghost. Special thanks to Oberon for hosting the show, and to my doctor for bearing with me while I figured out when my last tetanus shot was. Thanks for listening.
Pulling up to Mickey D's just for drinks? Oh yeah, that's me. Nothing extra, just perfection and a straw. Coming in hot for the coldest cups on the block. Because there are drinks. Then there are drinks from McDonald's.
Mix things up with any size lemonade or sweet tea for $1.49. Perfect with our classic fries. Price and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.